So as you heard in the children's sermon, moving is always an adventure. Counting the most recent move that we did just a few weeks ago, I have now moved over a dozen times thus far in my life. Some of them were pretty easy, while others were much more daunting. Probably my biggest, most exciting, most intimidating, most filled with the unknown move was when I moved to Washington, D.C. for grad school. The first hiccup happened even before we had left California. You see, I had bought my plane ticket before my new roommate, who was a friend of a friend that I had never met in person, but I bought my ticket before we had found a new apartment to live in. And unfortunately, once we did find a place, it turned out that the lease didn't start until 2 weeks after I was set to arrive, which meant that I had to scramble to find a place to stay. Luckily, another friend of a friend said that I could crash on their couch for those 2 weeks. But then when our move-in day came, the previous tenants, who my roommate knew, they said, "Hey, we need an extra day to get all our stuff out." And I had already well overstayed my welcome on that couch that I was occupying, but what was I going to do, kick them out? So I spent my first official night in my newly rented apartment in the living room on their couch, watching them as they packed, and they would offer me things that they didn't want anymore, which is how we ended up with this awesome Hello Kitty toaster, which I really wish we had hung on to. I showed that to Alyssa, and she's like, "You didn't keep that?" Now, although they did leave some stuff, we had to furnish the apartment mostly ourselves. I don't know if you've ever tried to buy a used couch when you don't have a car or know anyone else who has a car, but it is quite a challenging task. For me, it involved taking the metro, which is what the DC calls their subway, to a car rental place, renting a pickup truck, driving that truck to the house and buying the couch from a random stranger off Craigslist, driving back to our apartment, hauling it up 5 flights of stairs, fighting for our lives because it didn't fit in the freight elevator. If you've ever seen that episode of Friends, it was exactly like that. Then driving the truck back to the rental place before then taking the metro back to our apartment. I'm pretty sure that Jesus left out one group of people when he rattled off the Beatitudes, because blessed are you who own pickup trucks and help people move, for you will be rewarded with pizza and beer in heaven. Now, the other big purchase that I had to make was to buy a mattress. I'd never bought a bed before, so I walked into the mattress store, and I was had some sticker shock by the models that were out on the floor, and so I walked up to the salesperson and I said, "What's the second cheapest mattress that you sell?" I figured we could afford at least one step up from the bottom. He laughed, took me to a closet at the back of the showroom where there were several haphazardly stacked mattresses and said, "Here you go." Luckily, they delivered, so there was no repeat debacle of the couch situation. Like I said, moving and starting over in a new place is hard. And it's not just the physical demands either. It takes a great deal of courage and resilience to leave the safety, security, and support of your established community and to travel to a place where you have to learn your way around, try and make new friends, all while trying to understand and navigate the local customs and culture. It was tough for me at 22 years old, so I can only imagine how hard it was for a then 75-year-old Abram and his wife Sarai. All I can say is that I really hope that they hired movers. Now, the faith of Abram and Sarai, who would later be given the names Abraham and Sarah when God made his covenant with them, their faith has always astounded me. Their willingness to heed God's call, to travel where God led them, and to trust in God even though they weren't given very many details about what exactly awaited them. And what's even more impressive is that when you think about their story, it's easy to get the impression that God was in near constant contact with them, making covenants here, giving instructions there, and just generally interacting with them all the time. But in reality, if you count it up, God only talks to them a handful of times, scattered across the impressive length of their lives. which meant that sometimes decades would pass without any kind of contact whatsoever, not even a postcard. And so, if you ever read or hear these kinds of stories and feel like your own spiritual life or your own relationship with God is lacking, fear not, because there is always still time. God didn't call them to pick up and move until they were 75, and they didn't get the pregnancy announcement until they were nearly 100, which I can't even fathom right now, but it would seem that when it comes to God's timing, there is always the possibility of new adventures, regardless of where we are on life's journey. Not sure if that's exciting or anxiety-producing or probably a little bit of both. Now, Abraham and Sarah are the first biblical characters, at least in my opinion, to truly experience and understand that ours is a steadfast God. When you take the entirety of their life's journey into account, you see that we have a God who makes, keeps, and remembers the promises that she makes. And yet, when we talk about God being steadfast, or any of the other synonyms for that word that might come to mind, consistent, reliable, count-onable, we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that that means that God is opposed to change or new things. It's quite the opposite, actually. Ours is a God who boldly proclaims, "Behold, see, I am doing a new thing." And despite personally not being the biggest fan of change, I begrudgingly understand the need for it. I see the importance. And there is no one who embodied the new thing that God talked about doing more than Jesus. He came not to adhere to the established norms and rules of our world, but to lead us into a new way of being, to establish the kingdom of heaven. He came to turn things upside down or right side up, depending on how you look at it, with his teachings, with his message of mercy, truth, and love, with his focus on welcome and inclusion, and his belief that rules should help and heal rather than punish or exclude those who were in need. We see that in today's gospel reading, where he chooses to hang out with tax collectors and sinners. Now, tax collectors were not the most popular of people, and it wasn't just because of the whole money thing, although I'm sure that contributed. But it was because they were Jewish citizens who, for whatever reason, had chosen to work for the Roman Empire, the occupying forces who had oppressed and subjugated the Jewish people. Tax collectors were seen as traitors who had sided with the enemy over their own people. And yet Jesus chose to call Matthew, a tax collector, to be one of his disciples. He dined with and socialized with other tax collectors and sinners of all kinds. His way of doing things stretched the systems of that time to the breaking point, which is what leads us to the final verse of our passage for today, that well-known teaching of Jesus regarding the proper procedure for wine storage. Now, despite being quite a familiar vignette, when I was preparing for the sermon, I realized that I'm not sure that I've ever actually heard it read as an assigned reading on a Sunday morning. And it's not even technically supposed to be part of today's reading. The lectionary skips over these verses, but I chose to add them back in. And I'll admit that while I was familiar with it, I never really understood what exactly Jesus was getting at. Until, that is, I saw an episode of The Chosen during my paternity leave that elaborated on and explained it more fully. And seeing that episode is what finally made it click for me, and also what made me realize that years ago I had had my own experience with the necessity of new wineskins. When I studied abroad in the Czech Republic, we traveled to Brno, which is the country's second largest city, for their Young Wine Festival. It happens every fall. Everywhere you would turn, there would be vendors with little plastic cups offering you samples. It was like the best trip to Costco ever. Now, young wine, or new wine, as Jesus calls it, is a term for the transitional period when the juice from the grapes is still actively fermenting, which results in a delicious, very sugary, and relatively low in alcohol beverage. Although, given the active fermentation, you have to be careful about how much you drink. Anyone who has ever had too much kombucha knows what I'm talking about. And in addition to those gastrointestinal concerns, one of the main byproducts of the fermentation process is carbon dioxide, which, if not properly managed, can result in the buildup of tremendous amounts of pressure. So obviously, the best way to sell this highly volatile, gas-emitting beverage is in empty 2-liter water bottles, right? I mean, it was fine as long as you remembered to open the cap about every hour or so to let off the built-up pressure. The problem was people often forgot to do that, which is what led to our tour bus forbidding anyone from bringing bottles on board because of all the explosions that had happened over the years. Now, you need all of that background information to understand exactly what Jesus is talking about here. Okay, maybe you don't need all of it, but at least the part about the fermentation, because during Jesus' time, plastic water bottles weren't an option, but wineskins were. Unfortunately, old wineskins were far too rigid and unyielding to be able to handle the expanding, developing, changing, active nature of the new wine. A substance like that required a vessel that was far more flexible, malleable, able to give and stretch and grow. Similarly, the established ways of doing things when Jesus showed up were far too rigid and unyielding to handle the expansive, developing, changing, active nature of his ministry. Through this metaphor or parable or whatever you want to call it, Jesus was telling his disciples, as well as the disciples of John who had come to him with this question, that this wouldn't be the last time that his teachings would rub people the wrong way, cause friction or the building up of tension and pressure. His decisions about who to hang out with, what he required of his disciples, the messages that he would teach and the people he would reach, they would be like new wine that the old wineskin ways of the Pharisees and the people in positions of power just were not going to be able to handle. Jesus came as the physical embodiment of the new thing that God proclaimed to be doing. And again, I will be the first to admit that new things can be scary. They can be uncomfortable, unpleasant at times. They force us to stretch out of our comfort zones, and sometimes we might feel unable to handle it, just like those old, stiff, unyielding wineskins. But I promise, you are capable of far more than you think. As we tell Zachy all the time, you can do hard things. And if we're going to be filled with the new wine of Jesus' ministry, which quite frankly sounds like an absolutely delicious calling, we need to be as flexible, as adaptable, and as resilient as those new wineskins that Jesus talked about. Because life requires change, motion, or else it stagnates and withers. Which then begs the question, what new thing is God calling us to today? What is God calling us to as the church? Or the people of Bethlehem Lutheran, or maybe even just you in particular? There are many different ways to answer that, but if we talk about your life here in this congregation, Pastor Laura last week just shared about all of the amazing ways that we've been opening our doors, and the new ministry partners that we've been establishing relationships with. Are you perhaps being called to be involved with one or more of those ministries? She'll have information during announcements for you about it. Or maybe you're feeling nudged to join or rejoin one of the more established ministries opportunities here at Bethlehem. Or could it be that what God is calling you into is not even on our radar yet? Who do you feel that God is calling you to be today? And if you're sitting there thinking that you're done with newness and change and becoming anything other than what you already are, let me remind you that Abraham and Sarah became parents when they were pushing 100. God is never done bringing about newness and change and growth in our lives. Whether it's through Jesus and his teachings that challenge the status quo and flip things upside down and right side up, or through the Holy Spirit and that fire that she lights under our butts to get us up and moving, or through God the Creator, who invites us to be involved in the creative process of birthing and bringing about the kingdom of heaven in the here and now. What bold new adventures await us as the people of God? I can say one thing with certainty, that no matter what it might be, we have the assurance that our steadfast God will be with us every step of the way. Amen.